years. Lawyer, municipal councillor, teacher, sovereigntist member, chief whip of the Bloc Québécois, and more, Michel had a very full career that allowed him to make a difference in the lives of many people. Appreciated and respected by both allies and adversaries, we will remember him as a determined and passionate man, and let us not mince words, he was fiery and passionate, and his frank words still resonate in this House. But above all, he was available and wanted to serve. And he often entertained us in the evening with his Piano Man interpretation. So I offer my most sincere condolences to his wife, the former member Joanne Deschamps, his two children, his grandchild, parents, and all of his family. He left us too soon, but we will never forget you. Thank you, dear friend.
Déclaration, l'honorable député.
The Honourable Member for Glengarry Prescott Russell. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Last week, I was proud to announce over $120,000 in federal funding for two Rockland, Ontario businesses, Rona Lalonde et Fils and Potvin Construction. Our federal government has fully supported these business people and is committed to continuing to do so, not only through grants, but also through many initiatives that achieve positive results. For example, under our leadership, we have reduced taxes, the corporate tax rate, from 22 to 15% for businesses.
Significant tax reductions strengthen our businesses. They keep more of their hard-earned money to reinvest in employees and create new jobs. This is a winning recipe, Mr. Speaker, for economic growth and job creation. Je suis ravi.
I'm delighted that our government has shown its constant support for businesses in order to ensure growth of the Canadian economy as well as for all local economies. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Déclaration, l'honorable député.
The Honourable Member for Saint-Bruno Saint-Hubert. Mr. Speaker, my riding of Saint-Bruno Saint-Hubert is in a forested corridor that includes 4,000 wetlands, 18 exceptional forested ecosystems, and shelters no fewer than 84 species at risk. Today, we want to salute the work of Nature Action Québec, the Fondation de Mont-Saint-Bruno, and the City of Saint-Bruno, as well as of all of the citizens who are mobilized and working for the preservation of our natural environment. It's thanks to their commitment that we can claim such a great biodiversity in the region. All too often, the personal interests of some members of the other place threaten this environment that we care so much about. That is why I invite my constituents to join in on the many conservation projects of Nature Action Québec, the Fondation de Mont-Saint-Bruno, and the City of Saint-Bruno, so that we can continue to benefit from such a quality environment. Thank you. The Honourable Member for Lotbinière-Chutes de la Chaudière. Mr. Speaker, how can one become aware of the role alcohol plays in our lives in a simple and healthy way? Well, in answer, I would invite all of my constituents in Lotbinière-Chutes de la Chaudière, as well as across the province of Quebec, to join me in the alcohol-free 28-day challenge. The goal is to collect $100,000 to raise awareness of the 50,000 young people between the ages of 12 and 14 of the many risks related to alcohol and drug use. Over the long term, we all know that immoderate consumption is as devastating for young people as it is for their loved ones and family. I therefore invite anyone who would like to join for $1 a day for 28 days, follow their progress through a downloadable mobile app, and we can achieve this together. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Member for Guelph.
Mr. Speaker, January is Alzheimer's Awareness Month, a time to renew our efforts to be more attentive to and better combat Alzheimer's disease, its stigma, and the heavy burden it places on the family and caregivers of the hundreds of thousands of Canadian sufferers. In Canada, someone is diagnosed with Alzheimer's disease every 5 minutes, and with baby boomers approaching their senior years, this rate will increase exponentially over the next few decades. Beyond the $33 billion direct cost to our economy, this disease takes a terrible physical, psychological, and financial toll on the many families who care for a loved one with a form of dementia. Family caregivers spend hundreds of unpaid hours a year looking after loved ones with cognitive impairment. It shook the foundation of my family when my father, Miko Valeria, developed Alzheimer's. The disease took a terrible toll not only on his quality of life, but dramatically altered how my mother, siblings, and I related to him and to each other. In his memory, and the memory of so many Canadians with Alzheimer's, we all know, let's be the difference this year. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The honourable member for Willowdale.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It is my honour today to rise in the honour of Canada's first Prime Minister, Sir John A. Macdonald, as we celebrate the 200th anniversary of his birth this year. Our first Prime Minister turned his vision of trade and prosperity into reality. Sir John A. Macdonald approached challenges without intimidation and asked for a big vision for Canada. Canada's first Prime Minister was the first national leader to attempt to grant women and Aborigines the right to vote. Sir John A. Macdonald is remembered for his role in the expansion of Canada's boundaries from sea to sea, to completion of the Canadian Pacific Railway, and the creation of the Northwest Mounted Police. The 200th anniversary of Sir John A. Macdonald's birth speaks of what Canadians have accomplished together, to the historical moment that has served to define us and to the promising future of this great country. In this country where we celebrate our diversity, our values of freedom, unity, and tolerance, let us be reminded of the great words of our first Prime Minister. But above all, let us be Canadians. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Honourable member for Rimouski-Neigette. More than 1,500 people gathered last Sunday at the Saint-Robert-Bellarmine Church in Rimouski to pay homage to Monsignor Pierre-André Fournier, the Archbishop of Rimouski, but who was also president of the Assembly of Catholic Bishops of Quebec, who died suddenly on January 10th. He was the Archbishop for only 6 months, but he truly loved the community. And people could have believed that he'd been there for 60 years. He was humble and down to earth, so accessible and close to people that many people just called him PAF, his initials. He had the gift of making every person he spoke with feel like he was the most important person to him in that moment. He was omnipresent among the poor, the vulnerable, and those on the margins of society. And he lived by his motto, happy are the poor. He was generous with his time and rarely refused invitations to participate in community events. As one member of the huge crowd shouted during the funeral, "Thank you, PAF. Thank you not only for everything you did, but also for everything that you were."
For Saskatoon, Humboldt.
Mr. Speaker, today we honour Ron Ardell of Saskatoon, who exemplifies the faith of the common man that inspires us all. Ron and his wife of 40 years, Marianne, met at Moose Lake Bible Camp, where he was a camp counselor, she the camp nurse. They raised a family of 3 boys and supported many local community and sports events, flipping thousands of burgers with fried onions for good causes. Ron's tireless support of grassroots democracy focused on pro-life and pro-family issues, and is evidenced by his missing working in only 2 federal and provincial election campaigns in his entire adult life. A lifelong supporter of the local church, Ron viewed it as a calling to reach out to community and fellow neighbours in friendship and love. In 2012, he received his Master's of Theology degree, reflecting his lifelong love of God's Word. In 2013, he received the Queen Elizabeth II Diamond Jubilee Medal for lifelong volunteer efforts. In all that he has done, Ron has made, putting Jesus Christ first and foremost in his life, running life's race alongside his wife and family. I'll miss you, my friend. Thank you for being there for so many.
The honourable member for Kildonan, St. Paul.
Mr. Speaker, I want to express my sincere condolences to the family of Constable David Wynne, who will be laid to rest in St. Albert, Alberta today. Today I stand with all the families who have lost loved ones in the line of duty. What a tragedy that 4 RCMP officers have been killed in the line of duty this past year. With my own son being an RCMP officer who was on the ground following the Moncton shooting, I know the sacrifice and dedication it takes to be in the force, but none know that sacrifice more personally, more profoundly, or more painfully than the families and colleagues of a fallen officer. Mr. Speaker, I want to thank all police officers from all across our great nation for continuing to ensure our communities and our families are safe. Truly, they serve and protect.
Whatever you do. The honourable member Dartmouth, Cole Harbour.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I would like to thank the United Way for hosting their Living on the Edge poverty experience in Halifax last week. As I worked my way through the simulation, it was a powerful reminder of just how difficult life in poverty can be. You see, poverty isn't just about a lack of employment or money. It's a lack of safe, affordable housing, reliable transportation, healthy food, childcare, prescription medication, education, and training. See, poverty can box you in, limit your choices, and rob you of your dignity. I'm grateful for the many organizations and people of Dartmouth Cole Harbour who work tirelessly on these issues, including the Dartmouth Family Centre, the Public Good Society, Feed Others of Dartmouth, the Dartmouth Learning Network, and the Circle of Care Furniture Bank, to name but a few. As life becomes unaffordable for more and more Canadians, let's hope that 2015 is the year this government finally makes the elimination of poverty a top priority.
The honourable member for Cumberland, Colchester, Musquodoboit Valley.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. Over the break, I was pleased to talk to hundreds of families across Cumberland, Colchester, Musquodoboit Valley, and I was pleased to hear the confidence they have that our Prime Minister will protect the tax cuts that this government is delivering for Canadian families. They also expressed their concern at the Liberal leaders' plan to actually reverse these tax cuts, raising taxes upon Canadian families across the whole country. Now, this year, every parent in Canada will receive tax cuts equaling to about $2,000 per child, thanks to our expansion of the family tax cut and the universal child care benefit. Now, the Liberal leader has pledged to reverse these tax cuts and has threatened to do exactly what Liberal elites always do: raise taxes on ordinary, hard-working people and spend it on big bureaucratic programs because they don't trust parents to make choices for their own families. Canadians know that this Conservative government will continue to deliver these tax cuts, and they can count on them to do what's right for Canadian families. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Honourable Member for Argenteuil-Papineau-Mirabel. Mr. Speaker, I take this opportunity to pay homage to the former member for Argenteuil-Papineau-Mirabel, Mr. Maurice Dumas, who passed away on January 17th at the age of 87 years and 8 months. He served his constituents with integrity for 7 years, from 1993 to 2000, as well as the Quebecois people throughout his long life. A man of passion, well-known nationalist, and lover of the French language and Quebecois culture, Mr. Dumas was known as a man of action and was devoted to advancing our society. We will remember him as a man with a big heart, with strong roots in the community for which he worked. I invite all members in this House to join me in order to send our sincere condolences to his family and loved ones, and to remember one of our colleagues whose commitment could serve as an example for each and every one of us.
Etobicoke Centre.
The Russian-backed proxies of Vladimir Putin attacked Mariupol, killing and wounding over 100 people. A criminal act using Russian-supplied weapons like those that shot down MH317. Nadia Shevchenko, a Ukrainian MP and former pilot, was kidnapped by Putin's proxies in Luhansk last July 17th and delivered to Russia bound and gagged. She's jailed in Russia and resisting with a hunger strike. Shevchenko is falsely accused of involvement in the death of a Russian journalist and entering Russia illegally. Putin claims she's a prisoner of war, but Putin claims he's not waging war in Ukraine. This is right out of the KGB Cold War playbook. Lies, obfuscation, kidnappings, murders, and proxy wars. Vladimir Putin is turning Russia into a pariah state. The Russian people are suffering through a failing economy and Putin's rogue behavior. They deserve better leaders, leaders that the international community can respect. Today is Free Shevchenko Day, and Canada calls for Nadia Shevchenko to be freed. Slavo Ukraini, Mr. Speaker. Thank you.
The Honourable Member for Papineau.
Today to offer our respects on the death of a courageous and honourable Canadian, RCMP Constable David Wynn. L'agent Wynn a été blessé.
Agent Wynn was shot in the line of duty when he tried to arrest a criminal in St. Albert, Alberta, and tragically he died of his wounds last week.
Place, know the bravery of the men and women who work to protect us. My whole life, I have been fortunate to see firsthand the selflessness of the RCMP in times of crisis, and I am reminded of it today. Constable Wynn's wife, Shelley, said that the RCMP's recent support has been unbelievable. I rise today to say that she and her 3 boys have the support of this entire House and of all Canadians. We stand with you, and we will never forget his sacrifice.
The honourable member for Don Valley East.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Under the strong and dependable leadership of our Prime Minister, our government will balance the budget and put money where it belongs, in the pockets of hard-working Canadians. The last thing we can do is to put our economy at risk with high taxes and debt, as promised by the Liberals and the NDP. With the enhancement of the universal childcare benefit, moms and dads in my riding of Don Valley East and across the country will receive nearly $2,000 per year for every child under 6 and approximately $720 per year for every child between the ages of 6 and 17. But the NDP and Liberals want to take this money away and spend it on big government bureaucracy instead. Our government understands the challenge of balancing a family budget and saving for education while ensuring that Canadian children can take advantage of the opportunities available to them. On this side of the House, we know that Canadian families deserve to make their own decisions, and we are proud to be the only party standing up for them. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The honourable member for Burnaby, New Westminster.
Climate change continues to be a threat to our future and costs our economy billions of dollars, but the Conservatives are continuing to evade any action on the climate crisis. Now, the Prime Minister promised to introduce regulations on oil and gas emissions. For years, that was his stock answer. Just wait for the regulations. Then one day, the Prime Minister decided his own plan was, and I'm quoting him, crazy. Despite promising a cap-and-trade system in the 2008 campaign, Conservatives now say they are opposed to dealing with the climate crisis. What about the Liberals? Well, just a few days ago, the leader of the Liberal Party announced that he doesn't believe in any federal role in dealing with climate change. Shame. Now, this is the voice of a corporate party that champions the Keystone Pipeline and says carbon pricing is for others. Now, only the NDP can be counted on to take action on climate change. And later this year, Mr. Speaker, with a new NDP government, we will take action because Canadians deserve better.
The honourable member for Yellowhead.
Mr. Speaker, today, joined by family, friends and members of his law enforcement family, Constable David Wynn will be laid to rest in St. Albert, Alberta. With a heavy heart, we pay our respects to Constable Wynn for his dedication and service to our nation. He was an RCMP officer, a paramedic, a father of 3, noted for his work in local minor hockey and the food drive during Christmas. Let us also spare a thought to Auxiliary Constable Derek Bond, his partner, who was also shot in the line of duty and is recovering. Together, these 2 brave officers work to keep us safe, and for that, they have our gratitude. The horrific tragedy in St. Albert was a stark reminder of the dangers faced by all law enforcement officers. On behalf of the government and all Canadians, I would like to thank all frontline police for putting themselves in harm's way each and every day to keep us safe. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Good job.
I understand there have been discussions among representatives of all parties in the House, and there's agreement that we now rise and observe a moment of silence to commemorate RCMP Constable David Matthew Wynn, who died on January 21st, 2015 as a result of injuries sustained in the line of duty. Thank you, colleagues. Oral questions. Questions orales. The Honourable Leader of the Opposition.
Monsieur le Président.
Mr. Speaker, last fall, the NDP asked clear and precise questions on the deployment to Iraq, and the Conservatives repeated that our soldiers would be training the Iraqis and that there was no question of them being involved in combat. However, the Chief of the Defence Staff has confirmed now that the mission has changed, that our soldiers are accompanying the Iraqis to the front. The Minister of Defence has said that there is no limit to this commitment, but that's not what the Prime Minister said here in the House last fall. Why are the Conservatives, and why have the Conservatives hidden the truth from Canadians? The Honourable Minister.
Not in fact the case. We were very clear before Parliament that our Special Forces would be in a position to advise and assist, and that's exactly what they are doing, Mr. Speaker. And the reports that I have having, they are doing an outstanding job. Of course, there are risks, but they are risks that are being managed, and we're 100% behind our armed forces, and everyone can be proud of the work that they are doing.
We are proud of our forces, less proud of a government that doesn't tell the truth to Canadians, Mr. Speaker. Last fall, the Prime Minister specifically said that Canadian forces would not be pinpointing targets on the ground. The Chief of Defence Staff agreed that that would be a, quote, semi-combat role and it wouldn't fit with a non-combat mission. Is the Minister of Defence now telling us that he disagrees with the Chief of Defence Staff and with his own Prime Minister? Or is he finally willing to admit that this is indeed a combat mission?
We have been very clear, and we have been giving continuous up-to-dates to members of the opposition and to the public, just as we indicated that we would do. And as he asked if I agree with the Prime Minister says that if you shoot against Canadian Armed Forces, they will shoot back, Mr. Speaker, and I'm very proud of the work that they're doing.
Of course they have to defend themselves, but the real question is, why did the government put them in harm's way after promising Canadians they wouldn't be at the front? That's the real question. Mr. Speaker, we learned more today, that our forces have been caught up in even more firefights. How many gun battles? How many airstrikes? How many targets painted by our troops on the ground before the Prime Minister or this Minister finally admits that our troops are indeed in a combat mission? Stop playing with words. Our troops deserve better.
Honourable Minister of National Defence.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Well, we have been very clear throughout, Mr. Speaker, that we are there to assist the Iraqis in their fight against this terrorist organization, and we are there in support of our air fighters who are operating out of Kuwait. I know the NDP has some problems with this, Mr. Speaker, but I believe most Canadians are with us 100% behind our Canadian Armed Forces when they stand up against terrorism and take the fight to them.
The Honourable Leader of the Opposition.
Mr. Speaker, the Bank of Canada reduced its key lending rate to under 1%, a level not seen since the start of the financial crisis. The bank seems to clearly understand the economic risks and the impacts on the middle class. Analysts and economists are sounding the alarm. We have been sounding the alarm for some time now, but the only response from Conservatives is to yield to panic and to delay tabling the budget, hoping that things will recover on their own. Crossing one's fingers is not a good economic plan, Mr. Speaker. Where is the budget? The Honourable Minister. Mr. Speaker, our growth rate is higher than it is in most G7 countries.
Itself has said that our economic growth will be superior to 2%. The IMF actually was more optimistic. They said 2.3%, Mr. Speaker. We will we will honour our commitments to the provinces to increase our transfer payments. We will honour our promises to 4 million Canadian families. We will honour our promises to 780,000 small businesses, and we will balance our budget.
Honourable Leader of the Opposition. Speaker, for 9 years, the Prime Minister has put all of our economic eggs in the resource extraction basket, leaving our economy at the mercy of falling oil prices. The Prime Minister has dithered as hundreds of thousands of well-paid manufacturing jobs have disappeared. Now, with a string of bankruptcies across the retail industry, he's watching tens of thousands of those jobs disappear as well. Where is the Prime Minister's plan? When is he going to start creating the next generation of middle-class jobs? Where's the budget? This minister said one thing and its opposite day after day last week. The
Honourable Minister of Finance.
Mr. Speaker, Canadians understand that we have a highly diversified economy. The manufacturing sector is something that we're proud of and will continue to be an important contributor to the Canadian economy, and will be advantaged now by several things: the decline in energy prices and the fact that more growth will come to the global economy, and particularly the U.S. economy. We have a plan. The plan has created 1.2 million net new jobs. We have reduced taxes for Canadians. The last thing that Canada needs now is a high-tax plan, a bureaucratic plan, which will drive us.
The Honourable Member for Papineau.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. To strengthen Canada's middle class, the Conservatives responded to the drop in oil prices with confusion, delays, and secrecy. In the fall, the minister tabled an update projecting $81 per barrel for oil. Today, oil is closer to $45. Exactly how much has that difference cost the government so far?
The Honourable Minister of Finance.
Mr. Speaker, when I presented the Economic and Fiscal Action Plan, we based our results, our bottom line, on the then price. We made an adjustment of $2.5 billion, and when we present our budget, we will take into account the 15 private sector economists. As we always do, we will base our projections on their projections, and what we're saying to Canadians is that they should be reassured we have a strong economy, we will balance the budget, and will honour our commitments.
The Honourable Member for Papineau.
The minister's officials have given him the answer to my question. He is choosing not to share that with Canadians. Le ministre de l'Emploi.
The Minister of Employment said the government would not be using the contingency funding. However, the Minister of Finance indicated on the contrary that it could be used. The improvisation by this government is bad for the country's economy. Which of those two senior ministers is right? The Honourable Minister.
There's no difference in our economic forecast. We base it on private sector economists, all 15 of them. We take the average, and that's what we base our projections on. But you know, the leader of the Liberal Party last week told the hundreds of thousands of people working in the manufacturing sector that they should find another job. He has turned his back on manufacturing just at the moment that the manufacturing sector is emerging from the recession. The worst possible message to send to Canadians.
The Honourable Member for Papineau.
All Canadians support the right of our forces to defend themselves when they're sent into harm's way. The government said our ground forces would advise and assist, but not accompany Iraqi troops. Now we find out they're routinely on the front lines. Why did the government mislead Canadians?
The Honourable Minister of National Defence.
I'm not sure how you could train troops without accompanying them, Mr. Speaker, and we've been very clear that we would be in the business of assisting and training these individuals. What I don't get, Mr. Speaker, is the Liberal position on this, that we should know the outcome before we get in there and expect others to do the heavy lifting, Mr. Speaker. That has never been the Canadian way for 200 years, Mr. Speaker. We don't stand on the sidelines. We get out there and we stand up for those who are oppressed.
Honourable member for Halifax.
Bury their heads in the sand, but they can't hide from the fact that they have done such damage to our economy. 375,000 manufacturing jobs lost since 2006, a 13% youth unemployment rate, family incomes that are shrinking, and household debts that have skyrocketed to 163% of disposable income. Mr. Speaker, Canadian families need help now. So why are the Conservatives making corporate giveaways a priority?
Here. The Honourable Minister of Finance.
Mr. Speaker, I'm proud that our government has presented a plan, a benefit plan for 4 million Canadian families, every one of them, and a plan where 2/3 of the benefits will go to low and middle income families, 25% to families earning less than $30,000 a year. We also are providing a tax benefit for 780,000 small businesses, 90% of all businesses. We're doing what's right for Canadians. What the NDP proposed would create deficits, they would cancel the tax plan, and they would go back to the old days of high spending and high debt.
The Honourable Member for Halifax.
Mr. Speaker, the Conservatives can remain in denial, but job losses are mounting, and the inequality gap between the privileged few and the middle class, it keeps on growing. It's time to make the economy work for all Canadians. But instead, this government is taking billions away from hardworking families and giving it away to the wealthy few who don't need it. Will the Conservatives finally admit their backward economic policies are failing the middle class?
Here. The Honourable Minister of Finance.
The member opposite doesn't seem to listen to the answers. I said that 2/3 of the benefits will be going to low and middle income Canadians. There's been a 45% increase in the net worth of Canadians since we took office, a 10% increase in the real income, 14% for lower income Canadians. We've created a 1.2 million new jobs, and we're continuing to grow at a superior rate to that of developed countries. We have a lot to be proud of.
The Honourable Member for Hull-Aylmer. The Minister of Finance has pushed back the budget, claiming he needs time to see where the economy is headed. As for him, the Minister of Employment is already ready to get out the axe and has implied another round of cuts in public services. He seems in more of a hurry, in fact, to impose his ideological agenda than to take steps to stimulate the economy and businesses that create jobs. What is the government waiting for to show some economic leadership and to meet the needs of the middle class? The Honourable Minister. As the Minister of Finance has just said, we have seen the 1.2 million jobs created since the recession, and we continue to make major investments in labour market training. We have just announced the apprenticeship loans that will increase the number of young Canadians who are involved in training in specialized fields that lead to very good jobs. So, Mr. Speaker, we'll continue to make those investments and to cut the fiscal burden for Canadians while creating jobs. The Honourable Member for Hull-Aylmer. The Conservatives' poor management is hurting the Canadian economy. Since the start of the year, job losses have been in the thousands. Over the past 3 weeks, Target, Suncor, Sony, Bombardier, Mex, and Epica have announced major layoffs. The job losses and bankruptcies are on the rise, but the government is simply watching the train go by. Why is the government refusing to show some economic leadership? Why is the government abandoning the middle class? The Honourable Minister. Mr. Speaker, the Honourable Member is wrong. In fact, Mr. Speaker, job creation is our main objective, and that is why we have seen more than 1.2 million jobs created since the global recession. As I just said, Mr. Speaker, with a reduction in the fiscal burden, tax cuts, and reductions in and other measures to create jobs by small businesses and new programs for apprenticeship, etc. With this training, Mr. Speaker, we're going to continue to promote job creation. The Honourable Member for Musqueam-Nejet-Témiscouata Basque. Job losses are in the thousands, and we're in economic uncertainty, but the government isn't doing anything. It's simply denying reality. During the election campaign in 2008, on the eve of a serious economic crisis, the Conservatives said, no problem, everything's under control. It took the opposition parties coming together to urge the government into action. Instead of dragging its feet and refusing to face reality, why isn't the Minister of Finance showing some leadership to instill some new life into businesses and create jobs? The Honourable Minister. Mr. Speaker, the government is focusing on what is good for Canadians, jobs and economic growth. 1.2 million net new jobs have been created since the recession. The IMF and the OECD are predicting both, in fact, that Canada's economy will have the strongest growth rate in the G7 in the years to come. According to a report on salaries by the International Labour Organization, Canada is paying ranked second in terms of salaries in the G20. The Honourable Member for Musqueam-Nejet-Témiscouata Basque. Well, Mr. Speaker, they're simply stubbornly refusing to acknowledge reality. We can't wait for the budget to take action. Jobs are at stake. We need leadership. The government is appearing disorganized more than ever before. The Minister of Employment is calling for a new round of cuts, whereas the head of the Treasury Board is saying it's not necessary. The Minister of Finance doesn't know if he's going to have enough money to balance his budget, but he knows that he'll have enough money to put in place his ineffective income-splitting program. So why doesn't the minister now provide an economic update for Canadians to set the record straight? The Honourable Minister of Employment. Mr. Speaker, let's be clear. The NDP's economic policy will increase spending, increase taxes, increase the deficit, increase our debt, and all of that will kill job creation. It's the wrong direction. The NDP's policy is wrong. This government will continue to balance the budget, to focus on training for young people and the unemployed. We'll continue to reduce the fiscal burden to create new jobs.
The Honourable Member for Skeena-Boku Valley.
Well, Mr. Speaker, when it comes to the federal budget, it seems with Conservatives, different day, different minister, different answers. If panic and confusion could actually get us out of this mess, Conservatives would actually be doing something right. But their economic plans and their credibility are in tatters. And maybe it was the employment minister just jumping the gun a little bit when he let slip that big cuts were coming in order to fix his own government's mess. So will the minister confirm that he's willing to cut services to all Canadians just to pay for his reckless income-splitting scheme?
Hear, hear. The Honourable Minister of Finance.
Mr. Speaker, we will not be cutting expenditures. We will be honoring our commitments to Canadians. We will be providing tax breaks to 4 million Canadian families, tax breaks to small businesses. We will continue on our low tax plan for jobs and growth. We will reject the high tax, high spend policies of the NDP, which will bring us to ruin.
Honourable Member for Skeena-Boku
This is what their policies got us. They lost 400,000 manufacturing jobs. And just last year, when things were supposedly good, the Canadian economy grew slower than our population grew, and these guys want a pat on the back. Everyone can see that Conservatives delaying the budget is pure politics. Former parliamentary budget officer Kevin Page that says, in spite of their rhetoric, Conservatives are bad economic managers, that they built their budgets on a house of cards. The Bank of Canada, the private sector economists are all saying our economy is in real trouble. But just like 2008, the Conservatives are pretending that there's nothing to worry about. Right. Why won't the Conservatives come clean with Canadians, give us a real fiscal update on the situation now, be straight with Canadians for once?
Mr. Speaker, whenever I have an opportunity to attend an international conference, I'm struck by how positive the experts and people, decision makers and economists from around the world, how positively they view Canada and the Canadian economy. And certainly that was the view at the World Economic Forum in Davos. In contrast to that, Mr. Speaker, the opposition is mired in negativity and a desire to talk down Canada's success. And they do that with all their lopsided presentations. Canadians have a more positive view about Canada, a more accurate view. It's our view. We will not talk down this Canada. We will...
The honourable member for St. John's South Mill Pearl.
Mr. Speaker, the Minister of Justice is saying Newfoundlanders and Labradorians are demanding a, quote, CETA slush fund. Now that's coming from the minister who used a military search and rescue helicopter to taxi him from a fishing trip. It's also not true. What my province deserves is a, quote, transition fund for, quote, development and renewal, because that's word for word what the Trade Minister's Chief of Staff and Minister of State for HoC promised my province. Mr. Speaker, why won't the minister honour that promise?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As I've said in the past, we remain open, our government remains open to a transition initiative that includes support for displaced workers, research and development, as well as innovation. However, this fund was always intended to compensate hardworking Newfoundlanders and Labradorians for actual losses arriving out of the removal of MPRs. It was never intended to be a blank check that could be used to disadvantage other provinces.
The honourable member for Toronto Centre.
Mr. Speaker, last week the Bank of Canada said low oil prices will, quote, weigh significantly on the Canadian economy. The bank acted on its grave concerns by lowering rates to an astonishing 0.75%. Yet the finance minister has the gall to pretend, as he has done today, that the Canadian economy is in, quote, a good space. His actions belie his own words. Why else delay the budget? When will the Conservatives come clean with Canadians and present a plan to stimulate growth and create jobs rather than cling to their imprudent and expensive tax cuts for the Canadians who need them the least?
And the Honourable Minister of Finance.
Mr. Speaker, as I said, we will not have a budget before April because of the current instability in the market. We want to have as much information as we can. But Canadians should understand that the implications of a precipitous drop in oil prices will have different effects on the economy. Everyone knows it's going to advantage people at the pump, which should increase either consumption or savings. It'll advantage manufacturing and transport companies. It'll raise global growth around the world, but it will have negative effects on part of the economy. We're taking that all into consideration in planning the
honourable member for Kings Hants.
Speaker, last week the Bank of Canada cut rates because the bank's priority now is jobs and growth. But the Conservatives' priority is a $10 billion income-splitting scheme that does nothing for jobs or growth. And according to TD, income splitting will drive Canadians or the Canadian government $10 billion deeper in debt. When will the Conservatives realize that their pre-election income-splitting scheme does nothing for growth, is unfair, and now it's unaffordable? When will they scrap this $10 billion fiscally irresponsible scheme?
And the Honourable Minister of Employment.
In fact, this is a massive tax saving for families with kids to help them cover the cost of taking care of their children, Mr. Speaker, and we do not apologize for 1 minute for a package of tax relief and childcare benefits that will support 100% of Canadian families with children under the age of 18. The average benefit will be nearly $1,200. Families with 2 kids under the age of 6, Mr. Speaker, will be getting at least $3,800 in benefits annually. And, Mr. Speaker, we are proud to provide more support because, you know what, that's not the government's money. That money belongs to those working Canadian families.
The honourable member for Kings Hants.
Speaker, I guess it's that minister and not the finance minister who speaks on behalf of the government when it comes to the budget. But, Mr. Speaker, on January 14th, the finance minister said that his budget projections accounted for the lower price of oil. Yet, the next day, he said that the impact of the oil price was complex. and he postponed the budget until April. Speaker, which of the minister's stories should markets and Canadians actually believe? And more fundamentally, why is this minister creating instability when he should be strengthening the reputation of Canada in the world by introducing a real plan for jobs and growth?
The Honourable Minister of Finance.
Mr. Speaker, the member from the opposition may not want to acknowledge the fact, and that is that we've emerged from the greatest recession since the Great Depression more quickly and in better shape than other countries. We have half the debt on average in relation to our GDP of the G7 countries. We're growing faster than most of the G7 countries. Canadians are benefiting in terms of their net worth and in terms of their income. And we're able to sustain this international shock because we are in such strong fiscal shape.
The Honourable Member for Châteauguay-Saint-Constant. We hope that the new Veterans Affairs Minister won't follow in his predecessor's footsteps. Our veterans have been abandoned, set aside, and treated as if they were a burden on this government. The men and women who fought for us, they often have to wait months, even years, before they can access their hard-earned health care benefits. Will the minister commit to taking concrete actions to fix the mistakes made by his predecessor and start by reopening the veterans' regional offices? Honourable Minister of Veterans Affairs.
Mr. Speaker, it's a pleasure for me to rise in this House as the Minister of Veterans Affairs. And I want to thank the Associate Minister of National Defence and the two other members of this House who served in this capacity. Mr. Speaker, I'm the 31st Minister of Veterans Affairs, and I'm the 13th who has served the Canadian Forces. Daniel J. MacDonald, George Hees, illustrious names, Mr. Speaker. In the last 3 weeks, I've been listening across this country to our veterans, to their needs. We will make sure we meet those needs now and in the future.
The Honourable Member for Sackville Eastern Shore.
Mr. Speaker, for the record, he's my 11th minister in 17 and a half years, and these problems still continue. But I do congratulate the Honourable Member for Durham for his new post as Veterans Affairs Minister. I also thank him for his service to our country. And having said that, as a veteran and as the Minister of Veterans Affairs, does he now believe, because the Prime Minister and the former Minister wouldn't answer this question, does he believe the Government of Canada has a social, moral, legal and social and fiduciary responsibility to care for those men and women they asked to put in harm's way?
The Honourable Minister of Veterans Affairs.
Mr. Speaker, I'd like to thank the member for that question, and I'd like to quote Sir Robert Borden to this House, Mr. Speaker, that you need not fear that the government and the country will fail to show just appreciation of your service to this country. Mr. Speaker, our support for our veterans from Borden's time to today is important, but we also have to meet the needs, the evolving needs of our veterans, Mr. Speaker. In Borden's day, there was no support to Sam Sharp in his own caucus for mental injuries from war. I'm proud to say our government is moving mountains to make sure we address the mental injuries from service.
The Honourable Member for Hamilton East, Stoney Creek.
Mr. Speaker, for years we have seen human rights take a back seat under these Conservatives. Now we have the case of Raif Badawi, a free speech activist in Saudi Arabia, condemned to 1,000 lashes for making a website. And the minister waited until after he had 50 of those lashes before speaking out about his concerns in the flogging. Mr. Speaker, you will know that Canadians expect their government to speak out loudly and clearly on human rights abuses wherever they are. To the minister, starting here today, will you send an unambiguous message to the government of Saudi Arabia that Mr. Badawi...
just to remind the honourable member to address his questions through the chair, not directly at the minister. The honourable Minister of Foreign Affairs.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Canada does consider the punishment of Mr. Badawi to be a very serious violation of human dignity, and we do continue to call for clemency in this case. The promotion and protection of human rights is integral to our policy, and we promote and protect human rights. While Mr. Badawi is not a Canadian citizen, we will continue to make our position very clear diplomatically and publicly.
The honourable member for Sherbrooke. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Words are hollow if they aren't followed by concrete action. In my riding, there's a woman who's asking her government for help. If the government really cares about human rights, now is the time to show it. Raif Badawi was sentenced to 1,000 lashes for creating a blog that displeased Saudi authorities. He's already received 50 lashes. How many more before the government puts out a clear position on this? When will the government finally act and pressure the government of Saudi Arabia to free this activist? Honourable Minister of State.
Mr. Speaker, our government has been very clear. We have made our position known both publicly and diplomatically through diplomatic channels. We have called and continue to call for clemency in this case. While Mr. Badawi is not a Canadian citizen, we still continue to call for his clemency.
The honourable member for Brant.
Mr. Speaker, last week we saw how our government's strong support for manufacturing is creating jobs and generating economic growth in my community of Brantford and all across the region. Meanwhile, the Liberal leader was busy turning his back on Southern Ontario's manufacturing sector and on the hundreds of thousands of workers who depend on it. Many of my constituents were disappointed to hear the Liberal leader attack manufacturing. Can the minister responsible for FedDev Ontario update the House on our Conservative government's support for the manufacturing sector?
The Honourable Minister of State.
Southwestern Ontario's manufacturing sector is a driving force in Canada's economy, and our government is committed to helping these regional businesses and communities thrive. I, too, was shocked to hear the Liberal leader say that he has given up on Southwestern Ontario's manufacturing sector. Mr. Speaker, while the Liberal leader attacks and undermines this vital manufacturing sector, this Conservative government will continue to fight for these hardworking people, their families, and their jobs. Mr. Speaker, these comments are further proof that the Liberal leader is an economic novice who is completely incapable of managing Canada's economy.
The honourable member for Brassard-La Prairie. Mr. Speaker, last week, the investigative journalists at Enquête revealed that the report on the Lac-Mégantic tragedy was watered down. We cannot restore public trust if we allow such important decisions to be made behind closed doors. Canadians are worried. What's needed is a public inquiry on the transportation of dangerous goods by rail. Well, what is the government waiting for to act? Honourable Minister of Transport.
Are always with the victims in that tragedy in Lac-Mégantic. The Transportation Safety Bureau, Mr. Speaker, we should also note, is an independent body that actually formulates its own analysis based upon the facts that they find in the accident. What they found in this accident was it was caused by somebody who wasn't following the rules, that the Sûreté de Québec is actually following up with criminal charges in this matter. We've taken the report, we've taken the recommendations of the Transportation Safety Board extremely seriously. We've responded on a number of things, and we'll continue to work on this file.
Honourable member for Brassard-La Prairie. Since 2009, Transport Canada's spending on transportation safety has dropped by more than 20%. At the same time, oil transport by rail has increased by 2,700%. The Lac-Mégantic tragedy brought to light the terrible consequences of laxism at Transport Canada. When industry is allowed to self-regulate and there are cuts to oversight, we can expect the worst. Why is the minister obstinate in cutting oversight budgets at Transport Canada? Minister of Transport.
Rail safety has not been cut at Transport Canada. In fact, it has been increased. We take the oversight extremely seriously. Secondly, Mr. Speaker, it's also important to note that safety management systems in this country are the way to go. And indeed, the Transportation Safety Board has indicated that. It's a world-renowned system. It works very effectively in other transportation modes. It will continue to work effectively in rail transport as well.
Good answer. The honourable member for Churchill.
Mr. Speaker, thanks to recent media coverage, Canadians are finally talking about the horrific levels of racism faced by Indigenous peoples in cities like Winnipeg and elsewhere. From healthcare to police protection to employment and education, Indigenous people are too often treated as second-class citizens. And that treatment as second-class citizens often has a direct correlation with government policy put forward by this federal government. So the question is, instead of being part of the problem, will the Minister of Aboriginal Affairs commit to working with Indigenous communities and with Canadians to put an end to the racism that Indigenous people in Canada face?
Mr. Speaker, our government believes that Aboriginal peoples should have the same quality of life, the same opportunities and the same choices as all other Canadians. And that's why we continue to work and take concrete action on priorities we share with First Nations, with Aboriginals, such as economic development, such as good governance skills, training, and advancing treaty negotiations and reconciliation. And we will continue in that vein, Mr. Speaker.
The honourable member for Churchill.
Mr. Speaker, Indigenous Canadians want action, not rhetoric, and that's what we need to end racism in this country. Speaking of systemic discrimination, let's talk about Nutrition North. People in northern communities have been forced to root around in garbage dumps to find food. But instead of fixing the issues with Nutrition North, the government has said it's looking at alternative programs. We are such a wealthy country. There is no excuse for people in the north of this country to look to the garbage dump for food. So the question is, why is the government refusing to take immediate action in fixing Nutrition North?
Mr. Speaker, again, our government wants Northerners, like all other Canadians, to have access to quality and nutritious food. As a matter of fact, and this the member cannot deny, the results are clear. Since the implementation of Nutrition North, the cost of a food basket has gone down by $110 since 2011. Moreover, 25% more nutritious food gets to Northern Canada because of this program. And to add, the Auditor General has made recommendations which we have said we accept and will be implementing to benefit the program.
The honourable member for St. Paul's.
Mr. Speaker, we now know First Nations on reserve have been excluded from Canada's job numbers. The government is flying blind when it comes to the real needs for job training, a fundamental component of the Canadian economy. Canadians are fed up with this government relying more on ideology than credible information. Will the government close this unacceptable gap in employment statistics and stop making it up as they go along on the economy?
The Honourable Minister of Employment.
Well, Mr. Speaker, the fact of the matter is that Statistics Canada has never done surveys for the Labour Force Survey on reserves, including under the 13 years of the previous Liberal government, because Statistics Canada statisticians advise that there are very significant practical challenges to doing so. I have raised this with Stats Canada and asked that they come up with suggestions on how they can get better labour market information from reserves, because we do know that unemployment rates are typically far too high on Aboriginal reserves, which is why our government is investing record amounts in skills development and job training programs for Aboriginal people to ensure that they can benefit in Canada's prosperity.
The member for Guelph.
Mr. Speaker, I welcome the Minister of Veterans Affairs to his new role. I'm glad the Prime Minister has finally recognized how poorly he was treating veterans. A new face doesn't mean a change in attitude, though. This minister already started off on the wrong foot by excluding veterans groups with whom he disagrees from consultations. This doesn't offer us much hope for movement on major issues like reopening veterans' offices, ending budget cuts on the back of veteran services, and recognizing the sacred obligation owed to veterans. Why was this minister's very first act an attempt to silence Canadian veterans who have rightly called the government out for mistreating them?
The Honourable Minister of Veterans Affairs.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And it appears my friend's just as angry as he was last fall. And that's unfortunate because my outreach to veterans groups, Mr. Speaker, was about listening and reaching out. In fact, all stakeholders were called and talked to, and I found that there's tremendous diversity amongst our stakeholder community, those traditional organizations, those helping veterans, as well as those new groups, those peer-based counseling and support groups, Mr. Speaker. I'm going to be continuing to reach out and listening to all of them if we're all going to work together to help our men and women.
The Honourable Member for Abitibi-Témiscamingue. In 1961, the Government of Canada made a terrible mistake when it allowed the use of thalidomide and kept it on the market for too long. It was only in 2014 that this House unanimously passed a motion in support of compensation for the victims. The government had until today to act on the terms of the motion, and nothing has been done. Can the minister guarantee that compensation will be provided to victims as quickly as possible? The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary.
Absolutely assure the House that we remain committed to working collaboratively with the survivors to ensure that their health care needs are supported. Officials from Health Canada are working to undertake the analyses needed to approve spending. As you can imagine, in government, all sorts of spending programs will have checks and balances that need to be covered off. And so we're hopeful that the Minister will be able to make an announcement very shortly.
The Honourable Member for Victoria.
Mr. Speaker, thalidomide survivors just don't have the luxury of time. They've been suffering from their disabilities for their whole lives. The Canadian government told their mothers that thalidomide was safe. That means we have a moral responsibility to provide them with support now. In December, this House vowed to make things right, but today an important deadline has passed and the government still has not moved to action. Will the minister act quickly to give survivors the support they so desperately need?
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary, Minister of Health.
Nothing can ever undo the pain and suffering that has been inflicted on these survivors. This tragic event from the 1960s reminds us why we need to take drug safety so very seriously. I've had the pleasure of meeting with many members of the Thalidomide Victims Association of Canada and will continue working to ensure survivors are properly supported. We hope that the Minister will be able to make an announcement very shortly.
The Honourable Member for Thornhill.
Mr. Speaker, earlier this month we witnessed the terrorist attacks in Paris. One of the targets was, tragically, a kosher grocery store. Mr. Speaker, too often we've seen that enemies of freedom and democratic rights target their hatred against the Jewish people. Anti-Semitism is globally on the rise, and we must stand ready to fight this rising hatred. Can the Minister for Citizenship and Immigration please update this House on our government's efforts to combat anti-Semitism?
The Honourable Minister of Citizenship and Immigration.
Mr. Speaker, and on behalf of all members of this House, I'd like to thank the member from Thornhill for his leadership on this issue across Canada, around the world, in opposing anti-Semitism in all of its forms. As the member said, with Canada and the international community standing up to the menace of terrorism, to the ideology of hatred and violence it represents, we find ourselves increasingly dealing with the scourge of anti-Semitism, one that we thought had been left behind. And that is why, Mr. Speaker, Canada continues to participate in a meeting of the UN just last week called by Israel to address the rise of anti-Semitism. We outlined our government's leadership on these issues, which will continue under the Prime Minister's leadership, which will continue with the participation of everyone on these benches. We've opposed efforts to promote Holocaust remembrance and are opposing the deeply misguided boycott, divestment, and sanctions campaign. Mr. Speaker, this government will stand on the principle of opposing anti-Semitism.
The Honourable Member for Saint Laurent, Cartierville. Mr. Speaker, the Foreign Affairs Minister initially refused to intervene for Raif Badawi on the grounds that he's not Canadian. The Liberal opposition insisted that the minister publicly denounce the cruel and inhuman punishment being inflicted on this blogger and call on Saudi authorities to rescind the sentence, as has been done by the United Nations, the American government, and a number of other governments and Nobel Prize winners. Will the Prime Minister intervene directly with the new King of Saudi Arabia, as requested by Mr. Badawi's wife? Honourable Minister of State.
Yes, Mr. Speaker, to expand on what the Minister of Foreign Affairs, he recently raised Mr. Badawi's case directly with the Prince Turki Al Faisal, and Canada also made representations to Saudi Arabia's ambassador in Ottawa and Canada's ambassador in Riyadh has met with senior Saudi officials about the case, seeking further meetings, and Canada does consider the punishment to be in a violation of human dignity. We continue to promote and protect human rights and as an integral part of our Canadian force.
The honourable member for Victoria.
Mr. Speaker, sad breaking news. We've just heard that the first case of H7N9 bird flu in North America has been found in a traveller in British Columbia. This is obviously a very serious public health concern for all Canadians. Can the minister update this House about what measures the government will be taking to screen travellers and identify anyone who may have been in contact with that virus?
Yes, rather unfortunately, I can inform the House that the first case of H7N9 has now reached Canadian soil. The patient is being monitored, the patient is in isolation, and the patient is recovering. Health officials have also been in contact with the close contacts of that patient, and all of those individuals are being monitored. The Public Health Agency advises that the risk to Canadians remains very low, as H7N9 doesn't appear to spread easily from human to human.
The honourable member for Langley.
Mr. Speaker, the serious situation in Ukraine is escalating. Russian-backed rebels in Mariupol fired rockets that killed 30 innocent Ukrainians. This escalation of hostilities has resulted in a mounting civilian death toll and exacerbated an already dire humanitarian crisis in eastern Ukraine. Russia continues to not fulfill its commitment outlined in the Minsk agreement. Can the Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Defence please comment on this serious situation in Ukraine? Good question.
The honourable Parliamentary Secretary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I want to thank the member for Langley for his strong commitment in standing in support of the people of Ukraine. Our government is appalled by Russia's latest aggression, and we demand Russia stop its reprehensible actions. Russia must immediately abide by the Minsk agreement and respect Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity. Furthermore, today we join with the Canadian-Ukrainian community in calling for the immediate release of Ukrainian pilot and Member of Parliament Nadia Savchenko, who was illegally abducted and is now being held in Russia. Mr. Speaker, our government will continue to work with our allies to isolate Russia for their destabilizing actions in Ukraine. As the PM has said, Russia needs to get out of Ukraine.
The honourable member for Repentigny. Mr. Speaker, the Prime Minister promised to citizens that the Canadian Forces mission in Iraq would not involve combat or forces on the ground. However, it has now been acknowledged that Canadian soldiers are on the front lines. The Prime Minister needs to submit this week a new motion to debate in this House. Will he do so? The Honourable Minister of National Defence.
Under the government's decision that was approved by Parliament, the 6-month mission would come up for discussion and or renewal, if that be the case, in the first week of April. That being said, Mr. Speaker, members of our armed forces are doing an outstanding job standing up to terrorism in that part of the world, and we can all be very proud of that.
Honourable Member for Bar-Richelieu, Nicolas Bécancourt. Mr. Speaker, now that the price of oil has dropped, the fragility of the Canadian economy is clear. An oil bubble created by the federal government. Together with its partners, however, the Bloc Québécois has already proposed an economic recovery plan which would allow the federal government to diversify and modernize the economy. Yesterday, the Prime Minister said that he wanted to strongly encourage the manufacturing sector to favor Ontario and seduce voters. But what has he proposed for Quebec? Other, that is, than a pipeline where Quebec would assume all of the environmental risk but receive none of the economic benefits. The Honourable Minister of Finance. Mr. Speaker, the drop in oil prices is going to have an impact on the government's room to maneuver, but we will balance the budget in 2015. The drop in oil prices has a number of different consequences on the Canadian economy, including a drop in gas prices and a drop in energy prices for manufacturers, and that includes manufacturers in Quebec. The Honourable Member for Richmond-Athabasca. Mr. Speaker, the government has been caught with its pants down thanks to an economic strategy based entirely on oil production. This government, which didn't think that there was an economic crisis in 2008, didn't see the fall in oil prices coming, and now its re-election platform is in a shambles. And here's what worries us. We know that the government insists on moving ahead with income splitting for the wealthy and for a balanced budget. Can the finance minister guarantee that he won't cut transfers to Quebec or social programs to compensate for the drop in revenue? The Honourable Minister of Employment. Mr. Speaker, this government has increased transfers to the provinces, and particularly to Quebec, by billions of dollars. However, the people of Quebec want to see a reduction in their tax burden. They want to see lower taxes. And the reform package that we have put forward for families is going to help 100% of Canadian families with children under the age of 18 who will receive, on average, $1,200 extra dollars per year, thanks to the measures that we have taken. That's good for families in Quebec.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Last month in Lima at the climate negotiations, Canada signed on to a decision in which all nations are invited to submit their nationally determined contributions, in other words, the next round of pledges for cuts, within the first quarter of 2015. So my question to the Minister is, will Canada meet this request? Will we submit new pledges by the first quarter of 2015? Will it slide to a nebulous budget date? And will we actually have a pledge that will mean we can avoid 2 degrees Celsius global average temperature increase?
The Honourable Minister of the Environment.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, our government is working to negotiate a new global climate change agreement that includes commitments from all major emitters. We take the challenge of climate change seriously, which is why we are doing our part, reducing emissions in Canada and working with our international partners. We will continue to reduce short-lived climate pollutants under the Climate and Clean Air Coalition, the Arctic Council, and the Montreal Protocol. Our recent contribution to the Green Climate Fund will also help developing countries mitigate and adapt to climate change and promote private sector investment. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
That concludes question period for today. Tabling of documents, state voted document, the Honourable Parliamentary Secretary of the Government, House Leader.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Pursuant to Standing Order 36.8, I have the honour to table in both official languages the government's responses to 32 petitions.
The Honourable Minister of National Revenue.
Mr. Speaker, pursuant to Standing Order 32 sub 2, I am tabling in both official languages a document entitled The Taxpayers Ombudsman Annual Report 2013-2014.
Introduction of government bills. Déclaration de ministres.
Statements by ministers.
Reports from interparliamentary delegations. Presenting reports from committees, the Honourable Member for Elgin, Middlesex, London.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. I have the honour to present in both official languages the 29th report of the Standing Committee on Procedure and House Affairs entitled Bill C-586, an act to amend the Canada Elections Act and the Parliament of Canada Act, candidacy and caucus reforms. The committee has studied the bill and has decided to report the bill back to the House with amendments.
Introduction of private members' bills. First reading of Senate public bills. Motions. Motion. The Honourable Government House Leader.
Much, Mr. Speaker, and strictly speaking, this is not a motion, but it is an opportune time for me to rise and confirm for the House information that was given to the